Okay, hello everyone. Hope you all had a good Tuesday. And it was just a Tuesday. It's all good because now I get to read some awesome, more public domain stories that are awesome. I don't know, that came out weird. Anyways, we're reading Lovecraft today. The Color Out of Space. I have read some Lovecraft over the years. I'm not super familiar with the, I guess, mythos you could call it. The whole Lovecraft lore. I'm passingly familiar with some of it, but I don't remember most of the stories. I know I've read this one a few times, and I think I remember liking it. So I think it's a good pick for today, but I don't remember which one it is. So, let's get right into it and find out. This is The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, written in 1927. Holy shit, that's almost 100 years ago. That's scarier than the rest of this. Alright. Get up to my mic. There we go. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glints of sunlight. On gentler slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the single shingled sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. And look, I stumbled a little there, but this is already way easier to read than Conan. Robert E. Howard, his prose is hard to read sometimes, okay? Alright. The old folk have gone away, and foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination, and does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Ammi Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Ammi, whose head has been a little queer, valid word from back then, meant something different, for years, is the only one who still remains, or whoever talks of the strange days. And he dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now, but people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far toward the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of a returning wilderness, and some of them will doubtless linger even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one of the deepest secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean and all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham, and because that is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandams. Is that a Yank word for grandma? Maybe it's just a typo. Which grandams. Kinda cute. Grandam, that's kinda cute. I like it. I still think that's a typo, but which grandams had whispered to children through centuries. The name Blasted Heath seemed to be very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then I saw that dark westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but shadow lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. Okay, I keep making asides here, but I want to point out real quick, because this is something interesting to me, that already we can see just by writing style and the descriptions used how H.P. Lovecraft is very clearly from the Northeast. He's writing what he knows. Well, R.B.D. Howard is very clearly a Texas boy. He's writing what he knows. Because most of Conan's stories are out in the desert when they're not indulging in Robert E. Howard's fetishism of Africa, which is entirely a different thing. But it's just interesting because both Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft were at least pen pals. I don't know if they ever met in person, but they were good friends through mail correspondence back in the day, in their day. And they also share a lot of themes with cosmic horror and stuff. I don't know to what extent they like traded notes, but they do have themes that they both get into to varying degrees. Lovecraft is obviously a lot more known for the cosmic horror than Robert E. Howard is. Resuming. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there were little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, and sometimes with only a lone chimney or a fast-filling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned, and furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or chiaroscuro were awry. Chiaroscuro? I've never heard that word before. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like a landscape of Salvator Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut in a tale of terror. But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it, at the bottom of a spacious valley. No other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a... It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing new ever grown over those 5 acres of gray desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching. It did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There is no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ash, which no wind seemed ever to blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay at the rotting rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marveled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even in the old days, the place must have been lonely and remote. And at twilight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walk circuitously. Bastardized word, not proper word. Making up his own adjectives there. I walked circuitously back to town by the curving road on the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather for an odd timidity about the deep sky. I guess Lovecraft has as loose a relationship with English as Robert E. Howard does. Deep skyey voids. God. Voids above had crept into my soul. Sky. God, that is such a lazy adjective. Okay. Okay. Couldn't think of anything better for that word. Anyways. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the Blasted Heath, and what was meant by the phrase strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers, except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamed. It was not a matter of ode legendary at all, but something within the lifetime of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and a family had disappeared or was killed. To clarify, because this is for our sensibilities, the author clearly means the 1880s, not the 1980s, because this was written in 1927. This like I said at the beginning, this is a century old. Just a fun little note there. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Ammi Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in the ancient tottering cottage where the trees first began to get very thick. It was a fearsomely archaic place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odor which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man. When he shuffled timidly to the door, I could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing and white beard made him seem very worn and dismal. Walk over. Dismal. There we are. Not knowing just how he could best be launched on his tales, I feigned a matter of business. I told him of my surveying and asked vague questions about the district. Lost my line again. He was far brighter and more educated than I had been led to think, and before I knew it, had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I had talked with in Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. From him, there were no protests at the miles of old wood and farmlands to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been had not his home lain outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all that he shewed, relief at the doom of the dark ancient valleys through which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days. And with this opening, his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again, despite the summer day. Often, I had to recall the speaker from ramblings, piece out scientific points which he knew only by a fading parrot memory of professors' talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folk of Arkham would not speak much of the Blasted Heath. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into that dim chaos of old forest and face another time that gray blasted heath, where the black well yawned deep beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those utter secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit that country by night, at least, not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, old Ammi said, with the meteorite. Before that time, there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials. And even then, these western woods were not feared half so much as a small island in the Miskatonic where the devil held court beside a curious stone altar older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the wood. And by night, all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at Nahum Gardner Place. That was the house which had stood where the Blasted Heath was to come, the trim white Nahum Gardner house amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Orchards. Orchard is a color. Nahum had come Nahum? Nahum? I'm going to say Nahum because Nahum is fun to say. Nahum had come to town to tell people about the stone. It had dropped in at Amy Pierce's on the way. Amy was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently. Nahum declared that it glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with the geologist's hammer and found that it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic. Did they have plastic in the 1920s? I guess they did. Because it's an oil product. But I guess it wasn't very common back then because it still had literal tins of stuff instead of Tupperware. Never thought about that before. Huh. Where was I? But faintly in the night, all these soft, almost plastic, and they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen, for even the small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Amy's to rest, and seemed thoughtful when Mrs. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The day after that, all this was in June of '82. The professors had trooped out again in great excitement. As they passed Amy's, they told him what queer things the specimen had done and how it had faded wholly away when they put it in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and showing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax speed, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil, it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum. There is much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid, and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invincibility. Amy had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether. Ether? I think that's pronounced ether. Nauseous carbon disulfide and a dozen others. Whoops. But although the weight grew steadily less as time passed and the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, there was no change in the solvents I think this version of the stories have typos in it. Maybe it's one of those scan to text things. And the solvents to show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents, there seemed to be faint traces of the Widmanstatin figures found on meteoric meteoric, orky pig in it, meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker that they left all the chips made of the original fragment during work. The next morning, both chips and beaker were gone without trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professors told Amy as they paused at his door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk. Even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space, except where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another and larger piece with hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded within the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe. It was only by analogy that they called it color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it, appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow spherical space about 3 inches across, and all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the enclosing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as its predecessor has been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air, and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result. It presented no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the test, the college scientists were forced to own they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such, dowered with outside properties and obedient to outside laws. That night, there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they met with a bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour, the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with caved-in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of the utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment left carefully cased in lead. That fragment lasted a week, at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it. When it had gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure they had indeed seen with waking eyes that cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulfs outside, that lone weird message from other universes and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring, and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe. Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives. And Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. Excuse me. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. Fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwanted gloss, but in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early and was very cold. Amy saw Nahum less than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn, and were far from steady in their church going or their attendance at the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy, no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poor health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. They were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but appeared to think that they were not as characteristic of the anatomy of and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amy listened with interest to this talk until one night when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh on the way back from Clark's Corners. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of the rabbit were longer than either Amy or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by the firm rein. Thereafter, Amy gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the gardener dog seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. He had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way impossible to describe, while his face had taken on an expression which no one ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened, and threw the thing away at once, so that their only grotesque tale of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying of the horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an odd discussion in Potter's general store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning, and had noticed the skunk cabbages coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they held strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horses had snorted at the odor which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, went from mouth to mouth that there was a poison in Nahum's ground. Horsa was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found that stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day, they paid Nahum a visit, but having no love of wild tales and folklore, were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course, this was mere country talk, which such phenomenon as the aerolite? Is that a fancy word for meteorite? Aerolite would be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. So all through the strange days, the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, when given 2 files of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the queer color of the skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the meteor fragment in the college spectroscope. And like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss, the samples in this analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though later they lost the property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind, but even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthy listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was, indeed, rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed to half slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folk. When early saxifrage out, it had another. What the hell is a saxifrage? Came out, it had another strange color, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham, and I guess it is just shooed, not showed. It's just a weird spelling back then. And shooed, still gonna say showed, and showed them to the editor of the Gazette. But that dignitary did no more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great overgrown morning cloak butterflies behaved in connection. Okay. Connection with the CT with these saxifrages. I wonder if this is voice to talk then. And it misheard connection CT as connection. I can see that happening. This might be voice to talk. In which case, saxifrages might be saxifrages, but I never heard that either. Huh. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's, which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and through the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage, there sprang up bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased, underlying primary tone without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace. and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Amy and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture in the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped that the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course. But it told on his wife more. The boys were better off being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something, but they could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was the next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of a maple against a moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Boston who drove one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. Night had been dark, and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley, which everyone knew from the count must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distinct luminosity seemed to inhere in all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house, but toward the end of May the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which the trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in the grass and the leaves became apparent to the eye, all the verdure going gray. And verdure, I assume, means green because of verd, but I don't know that word. It was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Emmy was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do their errands in town. They were failing curiously, both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which it could not describe. In her raving, there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing, but when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. I feel like that's a really typical move in a Lovecraft story, having something locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours, and before that month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and in their neighing and kicking in their stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them. When Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found, they were seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end, he could do nothing but drive it into the yard, while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough the hayloft for convenient pitching. And all the while, the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hues had been so strange, were graying now, and the fruit coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollylocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest boy, Zenos, cut them down. The strangely puffed insects died about that time. Even the bees that had left their hives that in that sentence is making it hard to parse. Even the bees had left their hives. That shouldn't be there. Even the bees had left their hives and taken to the woods. There we go. One word can just ruin a sentence. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. He shunned people now, and when school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Amy, on one of his rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid. There's a lot of typos. I'm going to have to find a better PDF. That was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty. Amy advised his friend to dig another well on higher ground to use till the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had, by that time, become callous to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use that tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals, and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they walked half in another world between lines of nameless guards to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an inane titter or whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in the attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the mortality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, their meat being found dry and noisome? I think nauseous. Noisome. Nauseous upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat was, of course, useless, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach his place, and the city veterinary, from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling to pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles had developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would become uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or disintegrations were common. Last stages, and death was always the result. There would be a graying and turning brittle like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus. For what live beast of earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease, yet what disease could wreak such results was beyond any mind's guessing. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night and were never heard of again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but their going was scarcely noticed. There now seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amy's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot behind the farm, and had put therein what he found. Could have been nothing from outside. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact. But it was much as it had been in the barn. Amy and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling around the Gardners and all they touched, and the very presence of one of them in the house was a breath from the regions unnamed and unnamable. Amy accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, did what he might to calm the hysteric sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Amy thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then, Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Amy managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of the vegetation began, and trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Amy that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent over so slightly. But he had been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him. He must have inevitably have turned a total maniac. In the twilight, he hastened home, and screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum lurched into Amy's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host, stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pierce listened in a clutching fright. It was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and a pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days, and hardly knew what he was about, screamed at everything. There had been a fantastic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself no trace. And at the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too. But when the dawn came, and the man had plodded back from his all-night search of the woods and fields, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron, which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent bale and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pierce was blank, and Amy, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around, who shunned all gardeners around. No use either in telling the city people at Arkham, who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Merwin was gone. Something was creeping and waiting to be seen and felt and heard. Nahum would go soon, and he wanted Amy to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though we could not fancy what for, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 weeks, Amy saw nothing of Nahum, and then, worried about what might have happened, he overcame his fears and paid the gardener place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney. For a moment, the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish, weathered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling and brittle wreckage from archaic walls and gables, and great bare trees clawing up at the gray November sky with a studied malevolence which Amy could feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive after all. He was weak and lying on a couch in the low-ceiled kitchen, perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenas. The room was deadly cold, and as Amy visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Zenas for more wood. Wood indeed was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a cloud of soot blowing about in the chill wind that came down the chimney. Presently, Nahum asked him if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Amy saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Amy could get no clear data at all about the missing Zenas. In the well, he lives in the well, was all that the clouded father would say. Then there flashed across the visitor's mind a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. Abby? Why, here she is, was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amy soon saw that he must search for himself, leaving the harmless babbler on the couch. He took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. And of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amy threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Amy could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further, he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a half-second later, he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of the vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. Water. Excuse me. It was as he thought, only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, in which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of the young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. Amy would give me no added particulars to the scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gathered that no moving thing was left in the attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Amy walked conscious through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Amy heard a thud below him. He even thought his scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed by him on that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably, there was a sort of heavy dragging, and a most detestably sticky noise, as of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish thoughts, he thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God! What eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backward nor forward, but stood there trembling at the black curve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain. The sounds, the sense of dread expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow steps, and, merciful heaven, the faint but unmistakable luminosity of all the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed lathes, and beams alike. Then there burst forth a frantic whinny from Amy's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. Another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man on the dark stairs to guess what had sent them. But that was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sort of liquid splash. Water. It must have been the well. He had left Hero. Horse Hero. Nerd. He had left Hero untied near it, and the buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and knocked in a stone. And still, the pale phosphorence glowed in that detestable ancient woodwork. God, how old the house was. Most of it built before 1670, and the gambrel roof not later than 1730. People scratching on the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Amy's grip tightened on a heavy stick he had picked up in the attic for some purpose. Oof, that's an oof. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly toward the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk, because what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled, or whether it had been dragged by any external force, Amy could not say, but the death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapsing, gray, and disintegration were already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and dry fragments were scaling off. Amy could not touch it, but looked horrifiedly into the distorted parody that had been a face. Was it, Nahum? What was it? He whispered, and the cleft, bulging lips were just able to crackle out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color. It burns. Cold and wet. But it burns. Lived in the well. I seen it. A kind of smoke. Just like the flowers last spring. The well shone at night. Thad and Murney and Zenas. Everything alive. Sucking out the life of everything. In that stone. It must have come in that stone. Eyes in the whole place. Don't know what it wants. That round thing them men from the college dug out in the stone. They smashed it. It was that same color. Just the same. Like the flowers and plants. Then more of them. Seeds. Seeds. They growed. I seen it the first time this week. Got strong on Zenas. He was a big boy. Full of life. It beats down your mind and then gets you, burns you up. Well, water. You was right about that. Evil water. Venus never come back from the well. Can't get away. Draws you. Knows some that's coming, but 'tain't no use. I ain't seen it time and again. Sent Venus was took. Where's Nabby at me? My head's no good. Know how long since I found her. It'll get her if we ain't careful. Just a color. Her face again have that color sometimes toward night. And it burns and sucks. It comes from some place where things ain't as they is here. One of them professors said so. He was right. Look out, Amy. It'll do something more. Sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could speak no more, because it had completely caved in. Amy laid a red checkered tablecloth over what was left and reeled out the back door into the fields. Climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road in the woods. He could not pass that well from which his horse had run away. He had looked at it through the window. He had seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then the lurching buggy had not dislodged anything after all. The splash had been something else. Something which went into the well after it had done with poor Nahum. When Amy reached his house, the horse and buggy had arrived before him and thrown his wife into fits of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham and notified the authorities that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told of the deaths of Nahum and Nabby, that of Thaddeus being already known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be the same strange ailment which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Zenas had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end, Amy was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with a coroner, medical examiner, and the veterinary who had treated the diseased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing, and he feared the fall of night over that accursed place. But it was some comfort to have so many people with him. Check how much longer this is. Been an hour. Yep, we're gonna finish this on Thursday. What page is this? This is page 425. Let me note that. This is really cool so far. Oh, this is paragraph 2. Paragraph 2. Yeah, I mistook this title for another story that I know I've read before, and I like the story a lot more. It started off a little slow and plodding, but the horror really picked up. I'm really digging this. All right, that's going to be it tonight. Tomorrow, I believe I will be playing a video game of some sort. Haven't decided which one yet. But I will see you then at the same time, tomorrow night, 1:30 a.m. Have a great Wednesday, everyone.